I never imagined a single conversation could unravel everything I thought I knew about my life. My name is Sophie, and I'm 28 years old. I've been married to Mark for 5 years, and I thought I understood what marriage was supposed to be. We met in college, fell in love easily, and got married after a whirlwind romance. I was young and idealistic, convinced that love, no matter what, could fix anything. But as the years passed, I started to realize that love, though necessary, wasn't enough. Mark and I had become two strangers living under the same roof, trapped in a cycle of routine and silence. The thing is, Mark wasn't a bad person. Far from it. He was kind, hardworking, and, in the beginning, he was everything I thought I wanted. But somewhere along the way, we both lost sight of each other. The arguments became fewer, but so did the conversations. We didn't talk about the things that mattered anymore. We didn't even talk about the little things, the things that used to bring us together. And over time, we grew more distant, each retreating into our own world. I tried to keep things together. I really did. I tried to make the effort to reach out, but it felt like there was always something in the way. When I'd ask Mark about how he was feeling, he'd brush it off. He'd say things like, "I'm fine," or "I'm just tired." It wasn't enough for me. I needed more. I wanted to feel seen. I wanted to feel like I mattered to him the way I used to. But every time I tried to get him to open up, he'd retreat even further. It wasn't that he didn't love me. I believe he did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was broken between us, that something had slipped through the cracks. It was then that I started talking to Thomas. He's a colleague of mine, a few years older than I am, and someone I'd always considered a friendly acquaintance. We worked in the same department, but our interactions were usually brief and business-focused. But over the past few months, I found myself confiding in him more and more. It wasn't intentional. It just sort of happened. He had a way of listening without judgment, of making me feel heard in a way Mark hadn't for a long time. One evening, after a particularly tough day at work, I found myself sitting in the break room with Thomas. The stress of the day had worn me down, and I felt like I was going to explode. Thomas noticed the tension in my shoulders, the way I was fidgeting with my phone. He asked if I was okay, and before I even knew what was happening, I started talking. "I just don't know what happened anymore," I said, my voice trembling. "Mark and we don't talk. It's like he's just here. But not really. And I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I even want to fix it." Thomas didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there listening. I realized then that I'd been holding this inside for so long that I didn't even know how much I needed to say. So I kept talking, pouring out everything I'd been bottling up, my frustration, my sadness, my confusion. I talked about the distance between Mark and me, about the things we'd both failed to say over the years, and how I couldn't help but feel lonely in my own marriage. "I just want him to open up," I whispered, more to myself than to Thomas. "I want to feel like he cares." Thomas finally spoke. "Maybe he doesn't know how to. Maybe he's feeling the same way you are." I stared at him, taken aback. The thought hadn't crossed my mind. Maybe Mark didn't know how to fix things either. Maybe he was just as lost as I was. The conversation lasted for hours, and by the end of it, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't that I had answers, or even that I felt better. But I felt understood. Thomas had listened without judgment, had given me a glimpse of a different perspective. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel so alone. When I got home that night, Mark was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV. I wanted to say something, to tell him how I felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat next to him, and we fell into our usual silence. But this time, it felt different. It felt heavier. And I couldn't help but wonder if this silence was a reflection of everything I had just shared with Thomas. The next day, I woke up to an empty apartment. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming, caught in that groggy haze between sleep and waking. But no, it was real. The bed beside me was cold, and Mark wasn't there. I reached for my phone, half expecting a message from him, something like, "I had to leave early for work," or "Sorry, I didn't wake you." But there was nothing. I checked the time, and it was already past 8. Mark was almost always up before me, always the first to leave for work. But today, there was no sound of him getting ready, no rustling of clothes, no clinking of keys. I swung my legs off the bed, my heart already beginning to race. Something felt off, but I couldn't place what. I walked through the apartment, checking all the usual spots: the kitchen, the bathroom, the living room. Nothing. His shoes were missing by the door, his coat was gone from the hook. His side of the bathroom counter was neatly untouched. A wave of unease washed over me, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe he had to leave early for a meeting or had some sort of emergency. I called out his name, half expecting him to pop out from the bedroom or the shower with some half-hearted excuse. But there was nothing. I grabbed my phone and checked again. No messages. No calls. I felt the familiar knot of anxiety begin to form in my stomach. I left the apartment in a rush, not bothering to eat or shower. I dialed his number as I stepped into the elevator, pacing in the small space as I listened to the ringing. Voicemail, the robotic voice said, and I hung up before it finished. I tried again, and again. Each time, the same thing. Voicemail. I spent the next few hours trying to track him down, hoping that maybe he was just caught up in something or that he had an unexpected situation that kept him away. I called his work, but his assistant said he wasn't in yet and didn't have any meetings scheduled. I left messages with friends and family, asking if anyone had seen him or heard from him. Nothing. I tried not to panic, tried to convince myself that this was just a misunderstanding. But the longer it went on, the more I realized that something was wrong. By mid-afternoon, I found myself sitting at my desk at work, staring at the screen in front of me, but not really seeing it. I tried to focus on the tasks I had to complete, but all I could think about was Mark. The way he had disappeared without a word. The silence that had followed me throughout the day. Around 3 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. My heart leapt, but as I opened the message, the words made my stomach drop. Sophie, I'm sorry, but I need some space. I'm not sure when I'll be back. The message was short, blunt, and to the point. No explanation. No reasoning. Just a cold, simple statement. I read the message again, my eyes scanning the words, hoping that maybe I had missed something. But there was nothing more. No sign of emotion. No indication of why he was leaving or what had happened. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the message sunk in. I need some space. I'd heard those words before, usually in movies or TV shows where characters were on the brink of a breakup. It wasn't the words themselves that struck me. It was the finality in them. The absence of hope, of any intention to come back. But what was worse was that I couldn't shake the thought of Thomas. I hadn't spoken to him since yesterday, but I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation we'd had. I felt guilty, though I didn't know why. Had I done something wrong by talking to him? Was that the catalyst for all of this? Was Mark leaving because of my confession, because I had let someone else in when I should have been turning to him? I tried calling Thomas, but there was no answer. I left him a message, my voice trembling with the uncertainty of the situation. As the day wore on, I couldn't help but feel more and more like I was losing control of everything. Mark had disappeared, and so had Thomas. Neither of them was responding to me, and I had no idea what to do next. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, unable to move forward or back, trapped in a place between the past and the unknown future. It wasn't until late that night that I received another message. This time, it wasn't from Mark, but from Thomas. The message was simple, just a few words. I'm sorry, Sophie. I think I've made things worse. That was all. And just like that, the two people I thought I could count on were both gone. The next few days were a blur. I woke up each morning hoping it was all a nightmare, hoping that Mark would come home, or that Thomas would call me and explain what had happened. But each day felt like I was sinking deeper into confusion and dread. Mark didn't come back. There were no messages, no phone calls. I started to think I had done something wrong, though I didn't know what. I had spent days looking at the note he left, trying to read into it, to find some sort of hidden meaning in the words, I need some space. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like he was trying to distance himself from me, emotionally and physically. I couldn't understand it. I kept asking myself if I had been too much. Had I pushed him away? Had my words to Thomas somehow created this distance? Was this my fault? I couldn't help but feel betrayed. He'd never done anything like this before. Mark had always been the type to work through problems, to face issues head-on, even if he didn't always know how to express his feelings. He wasn't the kind of man to just disappear. Yet, here I was, alone in an apartment that no longer felt like home, with nothing but a note that didn't explain anything. It was the silence that was killing me. Not knowing why Mark had left or what had driven him to walk away without even a word of explanation. I tried calling him again, but there was no answer. No texts. Nothing. And then there was Thomas. He hadn't responded to any of my messages or calls, not after his brief text. The guilt I felt about our conversation was overwhelming. Was that the cause of all this? Was it the fact that I had trusted him with my feelings, trusted him with my vulnerability? I had told him things I hadn't even told Mark. And now, Thomas had vanished without a trace. It was like I had been abandoned by both men. I tried to focus on work, but it was nearly impossible. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time I sat at my desk, my mind drifted back to Mark. I kept imagining him somewhere, alone, thinking the same things I was thinking, wondering if he had made a mistake, wondering if he should have come back by now. But there was nothing. No sign, just silence. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting day, I went to bed feeling more lost than ever. I tried to fall asleep, but the thoughts wouldn't stop racing through my mind. I tossed and turned, trying to shake the feeling of abandonment that had settled in my chest. I kept wondering what I had done wrong, what I could have done differently. I replayed every conversation I had had with Mark in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, trying to find the exact moment where everything had gone wrong. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go to work. I called in sick, though I wasn't really sick. I was just empty. I felt like I had no purpose, like my whole world had come crashing down. My apartment felt like a prison, each room reminding me of what I had lost. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. I didn't have any particular destination in mind. I just needed to get out of the apartment. The city was bustling around me, but I felt so isolated. As I walked through the streets, I found myself in a daze, not really seeing anything around me. It was as though I were moving through life in slow motion, watching everything unfold but unable to engage with it. I stopped at a small park and sat on a bench, staring at the people around me. They seemed so content, so normal. And I wondered how they managed to go about their lives while I felt like mine had been shattered. I watched a couple walk by, laughing and holding hands, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest. Why couldn't my life be like that? Why had everything gone so wrong? I pulled my phone from my bag and checked again for any messages, any sign of Mark or Thomas. Nothing. I let out a frustrated sigh and threw the phone back into my bag. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. It felt like I was losing everyone, and I didn't even know why. I was about to leave the park when I got a notification on my phone. It wasn't a message from Mark or Thomas, but from one of my friends. They had sent me a link to an article with an urgent subject line, "Man found dead in local hotel room." I clicked on the link, dreading what I might find. The article was brief, but it was enough to stop my heart. It was about a man who had been found dead in a hotel room in the city. The name in the article was familiar, Thomas Whitaker. The story said he had been staying at the hotel for a few days, but no one knew why. The cause of death was unclear, but they mentioned that his body had been found alone, with no identification on him. My stomach twisted as I read the words over and over. I couldn't comprehend it. Thomas dead? Why hadn't he told me? Why had he disappeared? Why hadn't he reached out to me if something had happened to him? As the reality of the situation set in, a wave of grief and shock washed over me. My mind raced, spinning out of control, trying to make sense of what I was reading. But there were no answers, just more questions. And I was left alone, with only the silence to fill the spaces where answers should have been. The news about Thomas hit me harder than I expected. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me, like I was caught in some strange, surreal reality that didn't quite make sense. I couldn't stop reading the article, even though my mind was screaming for me to put it down. But the more I read, the more I felt like I was spiraling into a void. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze. I couldn't focus on anything, not even on the feelings of betrayal or confusion that had consumed me the past few days. My thoughts kept drifting back to the image of Thomas, gone, his life cut short, and all I had was a small article to explain it. I didn't understand how this had happened, or why he hadn't come to me if he was struggling. If he was going through something, why hadn't he reached out? I had trusted him, confided in him, and yet now I was left alone with no answers. I spent hours on my phone, trying to dig deeper, looking for any other details about Thomas's death. But the information was sparse. No one seemed to know why he had been in the hotel, and there were no details about his personal life, no mention of family or friends. Just a tragic, empty story. By the time I returned home that evening, I was exhausted. Physically, mentally, emotionally. The apartment felt colder than usual, even though the temperature outside had risen. I dropped my keys on the counter and moved aimlessly through the rooms. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe some sort of comfort or some sign that things could return to normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. I hadn't heard from Mark since his cryptic text. I didn't know what I expected when I tried calling him again, but when I dialed his number, my heart skipped a beat. There was no voicemail this time, just silence. The kind of silence that made me feel like I was losing him all over again. I sank down onto the couch, staring at my phone, not knowing what to do next. I had no answers. No explanation. I was stuck in this limbo, unsure whether to keep waiting or to let go. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that waiting wasn't working. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here, paralyzed by confusion and grief. The following morning, I made the decision to reach out to Mark. I couldn't keep waiting, and I couldn't keep torturing myself with unanswered questions. I had to know what had happened. So I sent him a message as calm and composed as I could manage. Mark, we need to talk. I don't know what's going on, but I can't keep living like this. I need to know what's going on in your head. Please call me. I hit send, my heart racing as I did. It was the first time in days that I had done something proactive. I wasn't going to wait for him to come back. I was going to take control, even if it meant facing something I didn't want to hear. A few hours later, Mark called. His voice was strained, like he had been avoiding this conversation as much as I had. There was an awkward silence on the other end before he finally spoke. Sophie, he paused, like he was unsure how to continue. I don't know what to say. I need you to explain, Mark. What happened? Where are you? Why did you leave? I'm sorry, he said, his voice tight. I just needed space. I couldn't breathe. Everything felt like it was closing in on me, and I couldn't deal with it anymore. His words hit me like a slap in the face. Space? He had just left without a word, without any explanation. And now he was telling me he needed space? Mark, you could have told me. We could have talked about it. I know, he replied softly. I should have. I was scared, Sophie. I didn't know how to fix things, and I thought if I left, maybe it would make everything clear. But it didn't. I've been an idiot. I swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room, and I was struggling to breathe. He wasn't making any sense. He had left me without warning, without any explanation, and now he was telling me he needed space? Was it that easy for him to just walk away from everything? I don't understand, I said, my voice shaking. You just left, Mark. You disappeared. You didn't think about what it would do to me? You didn't think about how I'd feel. I know, he replied, sounding almost desperate. I'm sorry. I should have talked to you, but I couldn't. I thought maybe if I left, I could figure things out. But I don't have the answers, Sophie. I don't know what's going to happen. It was like I was listening to a stranger. I didn't recognize his voice anymore, not the way it sounded so broken, so lost. My heart ached, not just for me, but for him too. I had spent so much time blaming him, but now I could see the cracks in him, the same way I had them. Mark, I don't know if I can do this anymore, I whispered. I can't keep living like this. We need to fix this, or we need to let go. I know, he said. I'll come home. We'll talk. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. We were going to talk. But what did that even mean? When Mark finally came home, it was like stepping into a scene I hadn't prepared for. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words, a tension that neither of us could ignore. I watched him walk through the door, his shoulders slumped, his eyes tired, and for a brief moment, I felt like a stranger in my own life. This wasn't the man I married. This wasn't the man who had promised to stay by my side through everything. This was someone else, someone I didn't recognize, but who I still desperately wanted to understand. He stood there, awkwardly, in the doorway, and for a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with the weight of everything we hadn't said. My heart was racing, my mind swirling with a million thoughts, but all I could do was stare at him. I had no idea how to begin. I didn't know if I should be angry, sad, relieved, or afraid. So much had happened in such a short time, and all I wanted was for everything to make sense. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I didn't know how to fix things. I didn't know where to begin." His words were thick with regret, but there was something else in his eyes, something that made me feel like he was just as lost as I was. "I don't understand, Mark," I said, my voice shaky. "You left. You just disappeared without saying anything. You said you needed space, but you didn't even try to explain why. I don't know what's real anymore." I know, he repeated, his hands trembling slightly. "I thought I could figure it out on my own, but I couldn't. I thought if I left, maybe I would find some clarity. But instead, I just realized I was running away from everything." He ran a hand through his hair, looking up at me with a helpless expression. "I'm not proud of it, Sophie. I was just afraid." "Afraid of what?" I asked, a knot forming in my throat. "Afraid of us? Afraid of me? You could have talked to me, Mark. We could have figured it out together. But you chose to leave." "I thought I needed to be alone to figure it out," he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to me. "I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. I didn't know how to fix what was broken. But running away was the worst thing I could have done." As his words sank in, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, relief, but mostly I felt exhaustion. The past few days had been a whirlwind of confusion and hurt, and now, here he was, apologizing, trying to explain, but it all felt too late. We had already crossed a line. The distance between us had grown too wide, and I didn't know if it could be bridged anymore. "I don't know what to do, Mark," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I can live with this, with how you just left me without a word." "I understand," he said softly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I want to try. I want to fix this. I don't want to lose you." I stared at him, searching his face for some sign of truth. Was this really Mark? Was this the same person who had walked out on me days ago? Or was this just the remorse of someone who realized too late what they had done? I didn't know. I couldn't know yet. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living in this limbo. I had to decide if I was willing to try again, if I could believe in him, in us. The truth was, I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if we could fix what was broken, or if it was too late to even try. But one thing had become clear to me during these painful days: I couldn't keep waiting for someone else to make things right. I had to be honest with myself. I had to decide what was best for me, for my heart, and for my future. "I need time," I said, my voice steady, though my chest felt tight. "I need time to think about this, Mark. To figure out if I can forgive you. To figure out if I even want to." He nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. "I'll give you as much time as you need, Sophie. I'll wait for you. I just want a chance to show you that I can change." And with that, he left. He didn't fight me, didn't try to convince me otherwise. He left, giving me the space I needed as I had asked. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, letting him go like that. But I knew it was the only way I could start healing. The following weeks were full of reflection. I spent time alone, sorting through my emotions, trying to piece together what had happened. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wondered if I'd made the right choice. But as time passed, I began to understand that healing wasn't a linear process. There were no guarantees, no perfect answers. But there was hope. there was always hope. In the end, Mark and I both found our way back to each other, slowly. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but we were willing to try. And maybe that was enough.